So following on from the last video, where we explored addiction as an industrial age illness and going into overdrive in the post-industrial era, I explored the idea that addiction is nihilism. So that brings us to a Nietzschean concept, an idea that's very well known and not first thought of by Nietzsche, but most famously expounded by Nietzsche. The idea that God is dead. I call that idea Nietzsche's knife. And the reason is because of the entire quote that God is dead comes from. Most people know God is dead is attributed to Nietzsche, or Nietzsche as our American brothers call him for reasons I do not understand. But the entire quote goes like this: God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? There's a lot in that. It's pretty profound. The two bits I'm going to pull out of that are the aforementioned knife. Obviously the knife is the knife that killed God. I suppose it's synonymous with reason, enlightenment, and ultimately atheism. Nietzsche was the son of a Protestant pastor. One gets the feeling he wasn't particularly atheist in a way, even though he's like the world's most famous atheist, the fount of all atheists. One gets the feeling, especially reading that quote, that he's none too happy with the death of God. But I'd say, as the son of he being the son of a Protestant pastor, I mean, the ultimate conclusion of Protestantism is probably atheism. You know, once you start to protest and break down and change the structure of a formal religion, then it's quite likely that it will eventually be dissembled further, right? So I think that's quite interesting. But the knife that he speaks of, the knife that kills God, is, if you like, the knife of individualism and modernity that Durkheim was also talking about, Emil Durkheim. But he says further, what festivals of atonement, so we need to atone for it, what sacred games shall we have to invent, in other words, to replace him? Now, that word sacred games is very interesting. I would suggest that addiction is one of those sacred games that we have to invent in lieu of God. That's a big statement. There's a lot of things that cause addiction, but as I keep saying, looking for a common denominator that underlies all of them, addiction really only comes into play when societies become more and more atomized, as all psychopathologies do, I would argue, apart from possibly genetically inherited organic brain diseases like schizophrenia that are probably there in tribal societies as well, Aboriginal societies. Most of the psychopathologies that are not so strongly genetically inherited, like addiction. There still are genetic potential gene polymorphisms that might predispose people to addiction, which I will discuss in another video. But most of these psychopathologies do seem to be peculiar to modern societies, certainly are in much higher rates. So I'd suggest that addiction is a sacred game that we've had to invent in lieu of a higher power. It's a festival of atonement. So for Nietzsche, famously, Christianity in particular was a cop-out. You know, it was a slave religion, as he famously calls it, meaning pointing to its meekness and, well, it was literally a slave religion. You know, it was literally the religion of slaves in the Roman era, and only later was taken on by the elites. So Nietzsche famously takes a great issue with that. He's a great fan of aristocracy and elites, Nietzsche, particularly of the Greco-Roman variety. And so he looks down on it for that reason. I mean, to represent him fairly, he would say that Christianity preaches false humility and martyrdom in the face of injustice. Then again, he did recognize, he seems to be recognizing the utility of religion, right, in this statement. So he seems to be saying that we will become nihilistic without God, which was a vein of thought that was explored by all of those late 19th century existential philosophers, I suppose you could call them. And there were many writers like Dostoevsky who were exploring similar ideas, that the idea that if there's no God, anything goes, which Dostoevsky explored in Crime and Punishment and many of his other books. So Nietzsche saw two options other than becoming nihilistic. Well, one option really, but he describes in one of his books, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, option one that most people would go for, which he called the last man. And the last man was a kind of fatuous individual who lived his life by the constant seeking of pleasure. So, you know, essentially an addict, and that pleasure would act as a self-medication to keep him from facing life's deeper questions, again, in lieu of there being no longer being a God. Option two was the Superman or Overman, Übermensch, that he's famous for, one of his most famous ideas. And the Superman was a kind of post-moral being who would proceed towards his own goals, unrestrained by the somewhat peevish morals of Christianity, right? So it was really only this Superman, as Nietzsche saw it, that could avoid post-religious nihilism. And he'd do this by performing a miraculous reevaluation of all values, he called it. So something like what became postmodernism and woke politics, Marxism, revolutionary Marxism. All of these things, ironically, could probably trace their roots back to Nietzsche. He would turn in his grave, obviously, as an arch-conservative, an extremely reactionary conservative. He would be mortified if he knew that he had spawned such plebby religions as Marxism, postmodernism, wokeism, but they all arguably are putting into play his re-evaluation of all values. In other words, their transvaluation, he calls it. With no God, a Superman can make it all up from scratch. That's the same idea that Dostoevsky was exploring in Crime and Punishment with Rodion Raskolnikov, his protagonist, his anti-hero, that I've discussed in another video. Essentially, it's a ripping up of the rule book, of the moral rule book, a starting again, a great moral reset. But I call this problem Nietzsche's knife, because while I agree that modernity has killed God and there are consequences, and we have festivals of atonement that we are now grinding our way through, and that we have new sacred games like addiction. I will do another video on how I think that addiction is literally neurologically nihilism. So the neurology, the neuroscience, if you like, is pointing that way, that dopamine is certainly not a pleasure chemical. Addiction is predominantly a dopamine-driven, brain-based behavioral illness. But the thing is, dopamine is certainly not a pleasure chemical, and probably not even really a reward chemical as we tend to think of it. It's the emerging research kind of tends to see it as almost a meaning-making brain chemical, or salience, a salience chemical. So the word salience means of the highest importance. So a lot of literature coming out of, say, for example, University of Michigan, I forget the researcher's name, but it's been postulated that dopamine is, while certainly a wanting chemical, it is also a chemical that promotes salience. It helps us to find salience. So it helps us to find what is of the utmost importance. That's what salience means. So obviously there was a time when God was of the utmost importance. It was the top of the pyramid in terms of our sense of meaning. With that gone, it seems to me Nietzsche is saying something must replace it at the top of the pyramid. And that's what the sacred games he refers to are. So anyway, I would say that Nietzsche, he got the right diagnosis, he's just got the wrong prescription. So his diagnosis of all of that is correct. We've become nihilistic, probably even on a neurological level. But the solution to that is not a post-moral Superman. I mean, in a sense, the addict is the Superman, not the last man, because the addict is ripping up the rule book and borrowing energy and a suit of armor to perform superhuman feats. So I see the addict as attempting Superman status. Probably winds up as the last man, the fatuous individual who seeks pleasure, but the aim is to become the Superman. When you are every day chasing drugs, you are really looking for God. So this is a very Jungian idea that all drugs are entheogens and an attempt to see God. So I'd say that what you get when you add up these traits of Nietzsche's version of the Superman, the post-moral Superman, what you get then is something like Vincent van Gogh or Paul Gauguin. You know, what you get is cut off ears and staring down the neck of a bottle of absinthe. That's what you get. no eye on morality, all eyes on creativity and the individual and the greatness of art and the greatness of individual achievement and such things. It just goes horribly wrong without the intervention of an external higher power, right? What you get is prodigal sons and people that pleasure themselves to death. That's what you get. Generations of directionless automatons, right? Jerking around to synthesize music and raving in piss-scented basements. That's what you get when there's no, if there's no God, anything goes, to quote Dostoevsky. So, no, warrior poets is not what you get when you dismantle your religious and ethical philosophies in a matter of decades. What you get is reinventions and fake plastic replicas. You get extremely reasonable sounding but completely empty stories, basically. And you get resurgent pagan rites and things like that. You get a resurgence of the old religions. You get scientism, science promoting itself to the level of a religion. You get secular religions, is what you get. And whilst we've already explored the idea that the woke takeover of things like psychology, the political activism that's so extreme over the last 10 years is a secular religion, and things like the childhood trauma movement in psychology is very cultish, a type of secular religion. There are many that are seeking to, that are new sacred games. So Nietzsche's knife is the progress, but at the same time atomization of society that is most likely the thing that underpins most addictions, which is not to say, and most psychopathologies, which is not to say that there won't be many other streams pouring into that river, because there will be. One's own life experiences, one's genetic makeup, the availability of drugs in your community, the amount of stress that you're under. But the thing that creates a market for mass drug abuse is the state of anomie, the state of nihilism that exists in modern society, most especially post-industrial modern society. And that is directly the result of things like the death of religion. For all of its sins, one thing it did do was create meaning. An addiction at its root is a disorder of meaning.